How did Robert the Bruce, a man who began his quest for the throne with murder, transform into one of the most revered kings in Scottish history? Through the epic customization of Mordhau, we'll bring this legendary tale to life with one-of-a-kind visuals. Join us as we travel back to the 14th century and embark on a journey through the tumultuous life, death, and legacy of Robert the Bruce, King of Scots. The Bruce family had Norman roots and had established themselves in Scotland by the 12th century. His grandfather was once a prominent claimant to the Scottish throne. Bruce himself was the fourth great-grandson of David I of Scotland, meaning he had a claim for the throne as well. Bruce was born on July 11, 1274 at Turnberry Castle in Ayrshire, Scotland. From birth, Robert was positioned within a complex web of Scottish and English politics. Scotland had a neighbor, a very aggressive, very dominant neighbor, known as England, and England had what we'll call an expansionist agenda. The two nations had a history of conflict, sharing an official border with each other since the signing of the Treaty of York in 1237. Cultural differences, territorial disputes, conflicting feudal claims, and more had set the stage for these issues to eventually boil over. Bruce married Isabella of Mar in 1295. Unlike many arranged marriages of the time, it is said that they were in love. The following year, Isabella gave birth to their daughter, Marjorie Bruce. Tragically, Isabella passed away shortly after the birth, leaving Bruce a new father and a widower. Bruce's rise to kingship is a long and complicated story that begins like many do in the Middle Ages, with an empty throne and far too many claimants. The year is 1286. Alexander III, the current King of Scotland, attends a council meeting in Edinburgh. After the meeting, he decides to travel to Kinghorn in Fife, where his new wife is staying, and against the advice of his men, Alexander insists on making the journey. At some point during the ride, Alexander becomes separated from his party. It is believed that he urged his horse forward, eager to reach Kinghorn and be reunited with his love. In the darkness and storm, Alexander's horse stumbles on the rough terrain. He was found dead the next morning, his body lying at the foot of a cliff. The Scottish throne was to pass to his granddaughter, Margaret, the Maid of Norway. King Edward, over in England, had plans for Margaret, including marrying his 5-year-old son, which would grant him control over Scotland. In late summer or early autumn of 1290, Margaret set sail from Norway to Scotland. She was only around 7 years old at the time. The voyage was meant to bring her to her new kingdom where she would be crowned queen, but during the voyage, Margaret fell ill. The exact nature of her illness is not well documented, but it is believed to have been a serious and sudden illness, possibly a respiratory condition exacerbated by the harsh conditions of sea travel. Edward's plan wouldn't be working after all. With Margaret dead and the throne vacant, there were many vying for kingship in Scotland, but two main claimants arose. Robert the Bruce's grandfather was the first popular claimant with his blood ties to David I. John Balliol, a wealthy Scottish nobleman, had just a slightly stronger claim to the throne. Edward, who was helping arbitrate between the Scottish nobles, decided at this time to assert his dominance. Edward stated that regardless of who won, he should be recognized as the ultimate authority in Scotland. Edward I was proving to be entitled and a bit pushy to say the least. John Balliol was willing to be the subservient king Edward seeked, much more so than other Scottish nobles. Subsequently, John Balliol, with the support of Edward, was appointed as King of Scots in 1292. Edward's ambitions were clear and his actions during the succession crisis decisive. He would do everything he could to ensure he had complete control over Scotland. While the Scots had their own issues, England was fighting the Anglo-French War. Edward demanded Scotland support him in his battles against the French, angering Scottish nobles. Being on good terms with France was in their best interest after all. In defiance, the nobles pressured Balliol to stand up to the English king. In 1295, Balliol signed a treaty of friendship and support with Philip IV, King of France, known as the Auld Alliance. This was done under the advice of the Council of 12, leading figures of Scottish nobility, who were essentially a group of Scottish guardians. The Bruce family didn't join their fellow nobles in this act of rebellion, leaving bitter feelings lingering among some nobles. March 26, 1296, Scottish nobles led an assault on the Bruce-controlled Carlisle Castle, but utterly failed against the might of the Bruce clan. This act was all Edward needed to justify launching his campaign against Scotland, quickly sending over 8,000 men to march on Berwick, demanding surrender. Several thousand would perish in this absolutely brutal siege. The Scottish rebels' cause would be temporarily suspended. Following the siege of Berwick, the English army advanced further into Scotland. Scottish forces gathered to resist them, leading to the Battle of Dunbar on April 27, 1296. The Scots were decisively defeated by the English forces, leading to the capture of many Scottish nobles and a significant weakening of Scottish resistance. Dunbar Castle's strategic location near the English border and its control over land and sea routes made it an ideal base for English forces to launch further attacks into Scotland. John Balliol was not present at the battle, remaining at his stronghold in Forfar. His absence was significant as it reflected his lack of direct military leadership and contributed to the perception of his weakness as a monarch. Shortly after, Balliol was stripped of his royal insignia in a humiliating ceremony known as the Tomb to Bard, empty coat, and imprisoned in the Tower of London, marking the end of his reign. Around this time, Edward infamously took the Stone of Destiny, the sacred stone upon which all Scottish kings were crowned, to England. Thus began the Wars of Scottish Independence, marking roughly 3 decades of conflict and warfare to come. The following year, Scottish rebellion intensified, led by legendary figures such as William Wallace. Wallace was born into the lower ranks of Scottish nobility, gaining notoriety during this time for his military endeavors and inspiring loyalty to the Scottish people. If anyone was passionate about Scotland, it was Wallace. Many brutal battles were fought as the Scots relentlessly resisted English occupation. Bruce's allegiance was ever-changing during this period. Although originally supporting the English, he also had deep ambitions for the throne and a love for his people. 2 generations prior, his grandfather almost had kingship in his grasp. Bruce's original English allegiance was a strategic choice made in self-preservation, as he had lands in both England and Scotland. A year later, seeing the passionate rebellion led by Wallace, Bruce decided it was the right time to switch back to fighting for the Scots. Stirling Bridge, known as the Gateway to the Scottish Highlands, would host a famous clash in September of 1297, a year after Dunbar. The English and Scots collided at the River Forth when Wallace refused to surrender to the English John de Warenne, the Earl of Surrey. Warenne, primarily an administrator, was not eager to fight the battle-hardened, ferocious Wallace. In an attempt to avoid battle, he urged Wallace to submit to him. Wallace replied, "We come here with no peaceful intent, but ready for battle, determined to avenge our wrongs and to set our country free. Let your masters come and attack us, we are ready to meet them, beard to beard." The English forces attempted to cross the river via a narrow bridge directly in front of the Scottish lines. Utilizing their height advantage, the Scots rained spears and other projectiles upon the English cavalry and infantry. Bogged down by their armor mixed with the mud, Wallace had trapped the English in front of the narrow bridge, his men picking them off. The English had been defeated this time. Shortly after, Wallace journeyed to and from England, conducting brutal raids across English soil. Wallace would return home to be knighted, gaining the title of Guardian of the Kingdom. Wallace served as a deeply inspiring figure. Robert Burns wrote, "At Wallace's name what Scottish blood but boils up in a springtime flood." During this time, Bruce was taking advantage of the weakened English forces in negotiating a treaty known as the Capitulation of Irvine. The English pledged to no longer forcibly conscript Scottish nobles for wars and to pardon those who had participated in the rebellion. This savvy political maneuvering would just be the start of Bruce's accomplishments. Things took a major turn for Wallace at the Battle of Falkirk in 1298. Wallace led a peasant army a mere third of the size of England's massive forces. The English were being led under the very capable, very ruthless leadership of Edward I, aka the Hammer of the Scots. Funny name, right? He was set on revenge for his loss at Stirling Bridge and the repeated defiance shown by Scottish nobles. At Stirling, Wallace had placed his soldiers in large, tightly packed groups called schiltrons. The men were armed with long pikes, groups looking like hedgehogs. The English knights failed to fight their way past them. At Falkirk, Edward I had learned his lesson. Rather than fighting the Chilterns close up with knights on horses, he used archers who could attack them from a safe distance. Wallace fought with his two-handed sword until nightfall, when he turned and rode off on his severely wounded horse. The horse carried Wallace across a river before collapsing, leaving Wallace to escape on foot. English and Welsh longbowmen, cavalry in superior numbers led to a resounding English victory, leaving roughly 20,000 Scots dead. Utterly defeated by his loss, Wallace resigned as Guardian of Scotland, opening up the role for Robert the Bruce to become co-Guardian of Scotland in 1298. Wallace was declared an outlaw, eventually betrayed, and captured in 1305. He was sent to London, where he was hung by his neck, cut down, then quartered, his head being placed on a pike at the London Bridge. These brutal actions served as a display of King Edward's power and to dissuade further Scottish rebellion. However, it would only serve to further revitalize the Scots' passion. It's time to properly introduce John the Red Comyn. The Comyns were one of the most important families in Scotland, with links to both the Scottish and English royal families. They were also longtime rivals of the Bruce clan. Nevertheless, Comyn would be co-guardian of Scotland alongside Robert the Bruce. They would have such a hard time getting along, Comyn was reported to have attacked and choked Bruce, only letting go when taken off of him by others. By 1300, Bruce decided to give up this guardianship due to the never-ending quarrels with his joint guardian Comyn. Their co-guardianship only lasted 2 years. The pair simply could not see eye to eye. If anyone stood in the way of Bruce in being the King of the Scots, it would be Comyn. He did, after all, have a slightly stronger claim to the throne. In 1302, Bruce switched alliances back to the English once again. He may have viewed cooperation with the English as a means to an end rather than a permanent allegiance. It would prove beneficial if he wanted to maintain his lands in both England and Scotland. Returning to the King's Peace, Robert inherited his family's claim to the Scottish throne upon his father's death in 1304. Shortly after, he would meet and marry his second wife, Elizabeth de Burgh, whose father was a close ally of King Edward. The pair wedded in Riddle, Essex, England, and would go on to have a total of 5 children. These actions caused some to speculate that Bruce was a traitor to the Scots, but regardless of his allegiance shifting, he would ultimately become one of Scotland's heroes and play a crucial role in the nation's independence. 6 weeks prior to Bruce's coronation, he met Comyn, his former co-guardian, at Greyfriars Church in Dumfries. The pair had a very secret pact that involved a plan to jointly assert their claims to the Scottish throne and work together to oppose English rule. Their conversation quickly devolved into chaos after a disagreement, a grisly scene ensuing. Bruce emerged from the church having stabbed Comyn at the altar. Some accounts say it was one of his men, not him, but either way, Bruce was directly involved. Severely wounded, but still hanging on to life, Walter of Guisborough wrote around 1308 that Comyn had confessed and was truly repentant, but by the tyrant's order he was dragged out of the vestry and killed on the steps of the high altar. The English described the attack as outrageous sacrilege inhumanely committed against God and the Holy Church. Bruce's competition for the throne had been eradicated. The following events would occur very quickly. Bruce was excommunicated by the Pope for this sacrilegious act and was outlawed by Edward I. He had murdered the English-backed Comyn, solidifying his Scottish allegiance and tarnishing his relationship with Edward. Robert and his men hastily rode to Dumfries Castle and subdued the English garrison there. Bruce was quickly installed with the support of Bishop Lamberton as King of Scotland at Scone on March 25, 1306. Many people were displeased with Bruce's actions, namely supporters of Comyn, leading his standing as king to be somewhat opposed. His wife Elizabeth remarked, "It seems to me we are but a summer king and queen whom children crown in their sport." Regardless, he had achieved his long-standing goal of becoming King of the Scots. Now he could truly begin his journey to secure Scotland's independence. The Battle of Methven was fought on June 19, 1306, west of Perth in central Scotland. At the time, Bruce was already defending himself from the allies and friends of Comyn, determined to deny Bruce's claim to the throne. Bruce would face the forces of Edward I of England, commanded by the Earl of Pembroke, who was joined by followers of Comyn. Bruce and the Earl had made an agreement to delay the battle for 2 days, so Bruce and his troops retired for the night only a few miles from the city of Perth in Methven. Bruce's troops were caught off guard and were overwhelmed when the English conducted a surprise attack 1 day early, resulting in a devastating defeat for the Scots. Bruce himself was unhorsed multiple times and narrowly escaped capture thanks to the efforts of his loyal followers. Bruce's loved ones would face dire consequences after this loss. The English targeted Bruce's family to demoralize him, executing 3 of his brothers and imprisoning the others. In 1306, Bruce's wife Elizabeth, his daughter Marjorie, and 2 of his sisters had already fled further north to Tain, where they were seized. Bruce's daughter and wife were confined in England, while Bruce's sister Mary and his aunt Isabella were to spend years in cages on public display, hanging from the castle walls at Roxburgh and Berwick. Edward I said of Isabel's punishment, "One who doesn't strike with the sword shall not perish by the sword, but because of that illicit coronation which she made, in a little enclosure made of iron and stone in the form of a crown, solidly constructed, let her be suspended at Berwick under the open heavens, so as to provide, in life and after death, a spectacle for passers-by and eternal shame." Following the defeat, and utterly humiliated from the abuse of his family, Robert the Bruce became a fugitive on the run. Here, around 1307, is where the famous legend of Robert and the Spider would be born. Bruce was in hiding and moving between safe havens in the Hebrides, an archipelago off the west coast of the Scottish mainland and possibly Ireland. Legend has it that when Robert's spirits were broken, he took refuge in a cave. He noticed a small spider attempting to weave a web. The spider tried and failed over and over. Each time the spider fell, it climbed back up and tried again. When it finally succeeded, he found the inspiration to return to Scotland in 1307 and finish what he had started with the English, employing guerrilla warfare and scorched earth tactics to squash out the English expansion. Edward I died in July of 1307, passing the English throne to his significantly less effective son, Edward II. The late Edward died of dysentery on his way to engage Robert the Bruce. The new English king would prove easier to outskill and outmaneuver, being known as a much weaker figure than both his father and Bruce. A pivotal moment unfolded on May 10, 1307, at the Battle of Loudon Hill. Facing overwhelming odds, Robert the Bruce, accompanied by approximately 600 loyal men, braced themselves for conflict against an English force nearly 5 times their number. The English army, led under the Earl of Pembroke, had previously dealt a severe blow to Bruce's cause at the Battle of Methven, where around 4,000 Scots perished. However, Bruce, having regrouped and honed his skills in battle, refused to endure another humiliation at the hands of the English. Prior to the battle, Bruce scouted the ground and dug ditches into the plains of Loudon Hill with gaps in the middle and placed pikemen in them. All they had to do was sit and wait, as English forces dwindled to the spears. John Barber describes Bruce's actions in his rhyming chronicle. The king upon the other side, whose prudence was his valor's guide, rode out to sea and chose his ground. The highway took its course he found upon a meadow smooth and dry, but close on either side thereby a bog extended deep and broad, that from the highway where men rode was full a bowshot either side. The restricted terrain and Bruce's tactical planning led to the English fleeing and the Scots emerging victorious. This win would serve as a huge morale boost and proof that the English could be defeated. It also helped solidify Bruce's standing among the Scottish people. From the plains of Loudon Hill, Bruce ventured northward, seizing 2 castles, burning 2 more down, and finally beginning to establish himself in Aberdeenshire. The Commons had considerable influence in Scotland and were determined to resist Bruce's claim to the throne, culminating years of utter, bitter rivalry going back far beyond the night in the church where John, the Red Comyn, was slayed. Bruce would come to a head with the Commons yet again. In 1308, on the fields of Barra, John Comyn, cousin of the slain John, the Red Comyn, and Bruce would face off, despite Bruce being severely ill at the time. Bruce's condition grew so poor he had to be carried by his men at some points in the weeks leading up to the battle. The king was taking time to rest and heal when a surprise attack was sprung upon his men at one of his outposts. In return, he rose from his sickbed, calling for his horse, stating, "Their arrogance has made me sound, therefore as the Lord wills I shall either destroy them or they me." Leading his army, being supported by 2 men on either side, Bruce approached the English. Astonished by the sight of the sickly king commanding his army, the English cavalry retreated, which caused a domino effect of their entire army fleeing back to their bases as fast as they could. Much of Common's army was captured or slaughtered as they fled the battlefield. With the destruction of the Commons' power base and the subsequent ravaging of their lands in Buchan, the Commons and other Scottish families no longer stood in Bruce's way. Bruce was able to turn his full attention to English garrisons, embarking upon his scorched earth campaign against their castles and culminating in the Battle of Bannockburn. Between 1308 and 1314, England repeatedly raided into Scotland, and Scotland repeatedly raided into England. Robert the Bruce reclaimed significant territories in Scotland, including the northeast after the Battle of Barra, the Western Highlands by defeating Clan MacDougall, and central and southern regions with the capture of key castles. The Battle of Bannockburn took place June 23rd to 24th, 1314, and would be a turning point in Scottish history, showcasing Bruce's strategic brilliance and leadership. Edward II had gone to great lengths to amass one of the largest and fiercest English armies of all time at 20,000 strong. Bruce, leading a unified Scotland, its people all willing to put aside their differences for a common goal, would make history with his army of 6,000. Inspiring his men, it is said, as Bruce met them, he greeted them cheerfully, speaking an encouraging word to one another, and they, seeing their king welcome them in such a forthright manner, were greatly heartened and ready to fight and die in his honor. On the first day of battle, the English approached, and Sir Henry de Bohun spotted Bruce riding in front of his troops. He charged full force at the Scottish king, who was lightly armored and armed with only a battle axe. Bruce turned and met Bohun's charge, barely evading the knight's lance at the last second, striking down his axe on Bohun's head, splitting both down the middle. Despite the concern of his men, Bruce was unfazed by this encounter, simply complaining that he had broken his axe. The death of the Earl of Gloucester weakened English morale while the Scots gained ground, driving their opponents into disarray. Concealing their forces in woodland shielded the Scots from English archers, while waiting for the English to cross a stream restricted their movement. Bruce's use of schiltrons caught the English off guard, trapping them between the stream and the advancing Scots. Deception tactics like employing men and women helpers to create the illusion of a larger army added to English confusion. A creative move from Bruce indeed. By this time, Bruce had perfected guerrilla warfare tactics, which he also utilized well in this battle. At one point in the battle, his men knelt in prayer, prompting Edward II to mock them, but an aide corrected him, saying they would conquer or die. Edward II simply wasn't the great king and leader that his father, the Hammer of the Scots, was. Bruce was a significantly more equipped and knowledgeable king despite his lacking numbers. He was fueled by passion and love for his country, making his ferocity and bravery hard to match. The Battle of Bannockburn was a decisive Scottish victory that significantly weakened English forces and morale in Scotland. It solidified Robert the Bruce's legitimacy as king and displayed his leadership on the battlefield. This was a great win for the Scots. Despite this huge victory, formal recognition of Scottish independence by England was not achieved until 14 years later with the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328. Regardless, the Scots were still determined to force Edward II to accept their independence. Situated just 2.5 miles or 4 kilometers from the English-Scottish border, Berwick-upon-Tweed was for centuries the northernmost town in England, which Scots recaptured in 1318. Edward II tried to besiege Berwick in 1319, but he was forced to retreat as a result of devastating raids by the Scottish army on Yorkshire that were led by Thomas Randolph and James Douglas. As early as September 8th or 9th, the English launched a storm attack on the city walls through which they almost penetrated the city. The Scots were able to repel the attack, as well as an attack by the English fleet on a port on the same day. Epic battles ensued with catapults, battering rams, siege towers, trebuchets, and ballistas all being used. At dawn on September 13th, the English launched a second assault on the city walls. The heavy losses caused by the 2 failed attacks demoralized the English soldiers. Edward II broke off the siege on September 17th and retired to Newcastle, humiliated once again. In 1320, Bruce and his supporters issued the Declaration of Aarhus, asserting Scotland's independence to Pope John XXII. It declared Scotland's right to self-governance and the authority of the Scottish people over their king. It reads, "For as long as 100 of us remain alive, we will never give in to the domination of the English." Bruce, once a young nobleman, had risen through the ranks of Scottish feudal society to become the most powerful man in the nation, the King of Scots, living an absolutely legendary life and forever shaping the history of Scotland. Bruce continued to defend Scotland against English attempts at control, leading military campaigns to secure Scottish borders. In 1328, Bruce successfully negotiated the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, which recognized Scotland as an independent kingdom and him as its king. He strengthened the monarchy through governance reforms and stabilized the country by building a loyal base among the nobility and people. Despite declining health, Bruce ruled effectively and ensured his succession and stability after his death in 1329, leaving behind an epic legacy and an independent and unified Scotland. Bruce would pass at the age of 54. On his deathbed in 1329, Bruce made a poignant request. His heart should be taken to the Holy Land and presented before God at Jerusalem's Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and finally resting at Melrose Abbey. Entrusted with this sacred mission, Sir James Douglas, a very close friend and follower of Bruce, received the heart encased in a metal urn, which he wore around his neck. Before Douglas had a chance to embark on this mission, he and his knights were drawn into a conflict against the Moors in Spain. In a final display of valor, Douglas flung the urn containing Bruce's heart ahead, crying out, "Lead the way, brave heart, I shall follow in your wake." Though Douglas fell on the battlefield, both Bruce's heart and his remains were recovered and solemnly carried back to Scotland. There, in fulfillment of the king's last wish, the heart was laid to rest near Melrose Abbey. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Have a lovely day or night, and I will see you guys soon.